Hey Robert, thanks for joining us today. We're talking clean code, and I'm really interested in this idea of intention-revealing names.
Glad to be here, Andrew. It's a foundational principle. Imagine a messy room. You can't find anything. Clear labels on everything makes a big difference.
Totally. So, how does that translate to code?
Well, a name like X or list1 tells us virtually nothing. What is this list1? Is it a list of user accounts? Shopping cart items? The name itself should reveal the intent of the variable.
So, Dason's creation is much better than just D, right?
Exactly. That name immediately tells you what the variable represents. You immediately understand its purpose and how it's used, without needing a comment.
Wow, that makes so much sense. But aren't there times where a shorter name is better, especially for internal, clearly defined variables?
Sure. I for a loop counter is perfectly acceptable. The key is to balance readability and context.
So, what about the example with a game board?
Exactly. Renaming the list to gameboard x0 to status_value and 4 to flagged instantly makes the code much easier to follow. It's like giving the code a voice.
So, classes can also help?
Definitely. Using cell with a isFlagged method hides the magic number and makes it clear what the code is doing. This makes the code much more maintainable.
I see. So, is there a risk of overdoing it with names that are too long?
Well, you want to strike a balance between explicitness and conciseness. The goal is understanding, not creating unnecessarily verbose names.
Great points. So, intention-revealing names are key for clean code.
Definitely, it is one of the simplest, yet most impactful practices. It's about building a language in code, so that it clearly communicates its purpose.
Makes perfect sense. Thanks, Robert. Hey Robert, I've definitely run into problems with names that, look almost the same but mean different things. Like, how do you handle that?
Yeah, it's a common issue. Disinformation in code is about using names that, mislead the reader. The intent of the code isn't communicated clearly by the variable names.
So like if you have a variable HP for hypotenuse, that's a problem?
Absolutely. HP is the name of a Unix platform. So a reader seeing HP in your code might instantly think hardware platform instead of hypotenuse.
Okay, so what's the best way to avoid it?
Use names that clearly reflect the variable's meaning. Avoid abbreviations that aren't universally understood within your project. If you're working with triangles, use hypotenuse directly.
But what if you need a short, concise name?
Use meaningful abbreviations that are consistent. And even then, if it could be misunderstood, avoid it. You could use HIP in a project exclusively on triangles, but not if the project was more general.
Okay, so the important thing is to make sure people don't have to guess, right?
Exactly. And it applies to spelling as well. XYZ controller versus XYZ controller. Minor differences can be easily missed, especially in a large project.
Wow, I see how that can lead to bugs. So how do you handle refactoring code with confusing naming schemes?
It depends. If it's just a few variables, you can rename them directly. For larger projects or libraries, you might have to refactor the entire module or class to update the convention.
So you're saying sometimes renaming an entire block is necessary?
Absolutely. The effort up front to prevent confusion down the road makes all the difference.
So it's important to be very precise.
It is.
And avoid common abbreviations.
Right. Be consistent,
Great advice, thanks. Hey Robert, so we've been talking about readability in code. You've said it's key.
Absolutely. Clean code is about making your intent crystal clear.
But what about these short variable names like J? Isn't that fine sometimes?
Not really for larger scopes. Imagine trying to find every use of a number 7, scattered across your code, or a single letter variable E. It's a maintenance nightmare.
So, you're saying long names are always better?
Not necessarily, but searchable names are crucial. Think about the time spent on debugging. It's way more efficient to find work_days_per_week than digging through all uses of the number 5.
Makes sense. But longer names make functions longer, right?
Yes, but you gain something way more valuable, maintainability.
What if the variable is only used in a really short method?
A very, very short method, perhaps, but even there, use a name to give it context.
So, single-letter names for local variables inside short methods?
Absolutely, for local variables inside very short methods only.
Like if I have a function to calculate the square of a number?
Precisely.
But what if it's just a loop counter?
Even in a loop, try loop counter or something similar to give it purpose.
Okay, so there's a trade-off, right?
Definitely. Readability and maintainability often clash with conciseness, but searchable names win.
So, a balance. Makes perfect sense. Thanks, Robert.
You're welcome.
Okay, great, let's move on.
Right, let's move on.
Robert, so we've been talking about clean code. This chunk seems to be arguing against including encoding type in names. Is that your stance?
Yeah, it's a common one. It creates extra work without much benefit.
I see. Makes sense from a learning curve perspective. But what about consistency, Robert?
Yeah, consistency's important. Encoding can make a massive difference in large systems.
How so?
Think of a language that uses special characters. Imagine a file name with a special character representing encoding. It'll cause issues. It creates problems in maintenance and can cause misunderstandings.
You're making a good point. That's understandable.
Exactly. It's a false economy.
I see your point. But wouldn't it be easier for people to use the same encoding?
It depends on the project. If it's a very small project, then probably not worth it. But the cost of adding encoding can be much higher if you're working in a large multinational team.
But what about legacy systems?
Then you have to convert to avoid these problems.
Okay, I get that. So, you're saying it's really just unnecessary complexity in most cases?
Generally, yes. But there might be isolated circumstances where encoding is needed for compatibility.
So a case-by-case basis, perhaps?
Precisely. It's more beneficial to create clear naming conventions that don't rely on encoding.
Thanks for that clarification, Robert. I appreciate the insight.
Glad to help. It's all about prioritizing maintainability and clarity.
Hey, Robert, remember prefixes, are they totally useless, or is there a time and place for them?
Well, Andrew, it's a bit of a case-by-case thing, but generally speaking, I'd say get rid of them when possible. Imagine how much clutter they are, especially in a long function.
Clutter? I see them more as hints like visual cues.
Exactly, hints that often become unhelpful as the codebase evolves, especially when you've got a helpful IDE. Your IDE should highlight member variables, you know?
So, no m underscore or m underscore variable. Is this a hard and fast rule?
Not a hard and fast rule, but for most code, generally no. Small projects, maybe they're fine, but in bigger ones, they're just extra noise.
What if you're working on a project with, say, 100 developers, all using different styles, in a very long-term project?
Still might not need M. The tooling now is so strong that an IDE can make the difference, with visual cues and colorization, even more than prefixes can offer.
So, you're saying clear code is more important than these little visual markers?
Exactly. Clear variable names make the code self-documenting, and that's the goal. Plus, prefixes, in long-term projects, start to just look like clutter. People just don't see them, and that's problematic.
So, a project might lose a little bit of context but gain readability?
Yeah, and in the long run, that's much better. Plus, a well-designed naming scheme can even be clearer than prefixes.
You know, for me, it's a bit like learning a new language. You start with the basics, but you need to move forward in the future.
Absolutely. Code evolves, you move on.
Robert, you mentioned leaving interfaces unadorned. Can you elaborate on why that's a good practice?
Yeah, clean names are key. Interfaces, you know, they're just contracts. Why clutter the name with interface or some implementation detail?
But if I'm looking at the code, how do I distinguish an interface from an implementation?
That's where the context helps. Good structure of the project often tells the story. Imagine a shape factory. Just shape factory tells me it's for creating shapes. It doesn't need to scream interface.
So, Shaperactory 1MP or Shape Factory are worse?
Absolutely. They're verbose and unnecessary. The implementation name should be distinct, but concise.
So, Shape Factory is unnecessary?
Exactly. Shape Factory adds unnecessary information.
I see. But what if the code is used by many developers and they need to know they're dealing with an interface?
Documentation and good project structure handle that, not the names.
Okay, but wouldn't clear documentation explain that it's an interface, making the implementation name more concise?
Well, that's true in some cases, but sometimes excessive detail in the names is just too much noise.
So, you're saying context is crucial?
Definitely. If your shape factory is in a separate, well-documented module, the name clarity is better. If you have a module with poorly named interfaces and implementations, though, you've got a maintenance headache.
Gotcha. So, clear project structure and well-written documentation are crucial?
Absolutely. Good structure helps you know what you're looking at. Imagine a legacy system where everyone encoded all the interfaces. The names became so bloated and unreadable. Maintenance became a nightmare.
So a clear project structure is crucial to ensure code readability?
It's almost always the case.
Thanks, Robert. That makes sense. So, Robert, you were saying clean code is crucial. What about variable names? Are there hard and fast rules?
Yeah, names matter a lot. Like, avoid mental mapping.
Mental mapping? Like connecting I to some loop counter? That seems a bit.
Exactly. Imagine reading a huge piece of code where C is repeatedly used. You're constantly trying to figure out what C means. That's mental overhead.
But sometimes I, J, even C are perfectly acceptable.
True for really small, local variables, and maybe.
Like a loop counter in a tiny function? Seems legit.
Exactly. But in most cases, descriptive variable names are significantly better for comprehension and maintainability. Think about debugging.
Right. So, what's a bad example of this you'd call out?
Sure, X to represent a user's age.
Ouch.
Unclear, right? What about user data or customer age?
Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, it's not just the names, it's the description of the variable itself.
Exactly. Clarity wins. Writing for others is more important than a perceived show of cleverness.
So how do you feel about, say, in a huge project, a team might decide on shorthand naming conventions for efficiency?
A common language is key, but clarity should always be paramount. If you sacrifice clarity for speed, the cost might exceed the gains.
So maybe a balance?
Precisely. Good naming, like good code, takes practice, understanding the code's context, and considering the audience.
Makes perfect sense. Thanks. So, Robert, you're saying class names should be nouns? Like customer instead of process customer?
Yeah, exactly. Clear, concise nouns help us understand the what of the object quickly.
Why is that better than, say, processor? It's kind of self-explanatory.
Processor doesn't tell us what it processes. Is it a customer processor? Is it credit card info? More context helps more than less.
Gotcha. So, data processor is not ideal?
Not ideal. What data? What kind of processor? Customer account processor is better, even though it's longer.
Okay, I see. Makes sense. But sometimes a word like manager feels relevant and the class does handle that.
You're right. It depends. Customer account manager, maybe you've got a class that orchestrates multiple functions like order orchestrator. Clear naming in those contexts is where the code starts showing problems.
So, a good rule of thumb is to avoid generic names?
Exactly. Be as specific as possible. Think about how you describe the class in a sentence. The class name should be that sentence distilled into one word.
So customer account manager is okay, but manager on its own is not?
Precisely. If you can clearly express the functionality of the class in one word, or a small noun phrase, you're on the right track.
This helps me think about naming consistency. Great.
Absolutely. It's all about communicating clearly and efficiently in the code.
If there are some widely accepted abbreviations, can they be used instead?
Definitely. Like API or HTTP. If it's a well-known abbreviation, it can improve clarity, but it still should be used thoughtfully.
Thanks, Robert. Clear now. It's not just about nouns, but about clarifying function too.
Exactly. It's about context. You need to remember why you're making your program and why each of the parts of it exists.
Hey, Robert, so we were talking about writing clean code, and I've always found that naming things clearly makes a massive difference. Can you tell me more about specific naming conventions for methods?
Absolutely. Clean code is about readability and maintainability. Method names should be clear actions. Think verbs or verb phrases. Post payment, delete page, save, things like that. And for getting, setting, or checking values, like getName, setName, is posted, that's the JavaBeans standard. It makes the code much more understandable.
So, static factory methods. What's the deal with those?
They're super helpful. Imagine you have a complex class with overloaded constructors for different inputs. Using a static from real number method is clearer. Complex fulcrum point equals complex from real number, 23.0. It's much more self-documenting than a constructor.
Why is this better?
It expresses the intent of creating a complex number from a real number, instead of just creating a complex object, making the code's purpose more immediately evident. You avoid ambiguity, improve readability, and reduce cognitive load.
So, you're saying a method should show what it does, not just what it is as a class.
Exactly. A static factory really clarifies the object's creation logic.
What about enforcing these conventions? Can you use tools to automatically check code style?
Absolutely. There are great linters and style checkers that can help you enforce these rules. It prevents those subtle mistakes that can bite you later.
Makes total sense. So, automatic style checking tools, are they your favorite?
They are an excellent aid, but consistency should also come from individual awareness of good practices.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's a blend of tools and conscious coding.
So, this really helps readability in projects. Thanks, Robert. Robert, you mentioned the importance of readable code. How does that translate into choosing names for variables and functions?
Clarity's key. Avoid cleverness. A name like Toady Grenade. Well, it's cute, but what does it do?
Right, totally cryptic. So, what's the alternative?
Descriptive names. Calculate Totaldistanz. Process order. Straightforward, you know what they do.
Calculate total distance. That's pretty obvious. But sometimes things are a bit more complex. How do you strike that balance?
Even complex tasks can be named clearly. Break down the function into smaller, descriptive pieces. Avoid jargon, like using whack, instead of remove obstacles. Keep it simple.
Good point. A name like whack might sound cool.
But remove obstacles is clearer. And maintainable. Think of it like a user interface. It should always be clear to the user what they're clicking.
Could you give me an example?
Yeah, instead of eat me shorts, for aborting.
Yikes.
Use cancel operation. It's direct. No hidden jokes or slang.
That makes sense. Does it really matter if code isn't overly cute or clever, especially if it works?
Long term, absolutely. Maintainability and understanding become crucial as projects grow.
So, are there ever exceptions? Are there specific instances where creative names might be helpful?
In internal projects, maybe, but even then, clarity often wins out.
Got it. Thanks for the insight.
My pleasure.
Okay, Rob, you mentioned using technical terms in code. Can you give us a specific example? Like, what's a better name than something like account visitor?
Absolutely. Account visitor is, well, kind of vague. A visitor pattern is a very common design pattern in object-oriented programming.
Right, but is that always the best choice?
A visitor is clear. It immediately conveys the intent of the code.
So, a visitor pattern, what does it do?
It allows you to apply a function to each node in a tree-like structure.
So, account visitor, what was the structure?
We don't know. Was it a binary tree? A linked list? Visitor is more specific than account visitor.
Okay, I see. A technical name like visitor is more efficient. So, a subqueue would be great too?
Absolutely. A subqueue is a queue. It's used for something specific related to error handling. The name is immediately understandable in the context of programming.
But wouldn't a more descriptive name, like error logging queue, be clearer?
It could be. But programmers generally already know what a queue does, and subqueue signals it's more complex than a simple queue.
So, in the context of something specific, a domain-specific name could be good?
Yes, absolutely. A domain name is okay if the context is clear. A technical term is more universal though.
Gotcha.
So, it's about knowing your audience. Programmers will recognize visitor or sub-queue immediately. Choosing names that are immediately recognizable within your tech team is a good approach.
Interesting. What about code bases that have a particular naming convention?
Maintaining consistency is important. If the team is using a certain naming pattern, it should be adhered to.
So, for clarity, domain-specific might be okay with specific context, but for maintainability in the project, stick with the technical terms?
Yeah. It's balancing context with a more universal language.
That makes sense. Thanks, Rob.
You're welcome.
Hey, Robert. Great to have you on. We're diving into clean code today. How do you define context in programming?
Context in code is the surrounding information that clarifies the meaning and purpose of variables, functions, and other elements. It's like giving them a descriptive label. Good context allows anyone to immediately grasp the intent.
So, if I see a variable named number, that's not very descriptive, right?
Exactly. Just number doesn't tell you anything. Is it a house number? A phone number? A quantity? You need context.
What are some of the best ways to add context to code?
Well, you can use well-named classes, namespaces, or functions. Imagine those first name, last name, etc. variables you mentioned. They belong to an address class.
That makes total sense. So, you're saying grouping data into classes helps?
Yes. It's much better than prefixes. You might prefix the variable with address, but a dedicated class clarifies everything.
Okay, so let's look at this example. Variables like number, verb, and plural modifier. What's the problem here?
The variables are in a void function, print guess statistics, but there's no clear context of what the numbers represent. You have to read the whole method to understand their relationship.
Right. So you mean those variables aren't self-explanatory?
Exactly. The lack of context makes the code harder to understand and modify.
So how can we fix that?
Wrap those variables into a guess statistics message class. That gives them inherent context. The variables are now undeniably part of the message.
So, it's like putting them inside an envelope?
Exactly. Now it's clear these variables belong together.
Makes a lot of sense, Robert. Thanks for explaining that.
No problem, Andrew. Clean code is about readability and maintainability. It's an important topic to continue digging into.
Okay, Robert, so we're talking clean code, and you're saying concise naming is key. Can you give us a quick example of a bad naming practice?
Sure. Imagine a class called So Account Billing System. Ugh, way too much.
Right? What's wrong with that?
It's unnecessarily verbose. Account billing system is crystal clear. The so prefix adds nothing. It just clutters up the code and makes the IDE's autocomplete a nightmare.
Wow. So, how do we decide when a prefix like that is useful?
Well, you use it only if it actually helps with understanding or organization within a context that is significant and complex enough that the identifier is key. Say you have a whole suite of accounting classes. Using a descriptive prefix like so becomes important in maintaining clarity.
But isn't it about code maintainability?
Absolutely. Short names are better unless they lose context. This way, you don't end up with a jumbled mess of long names. It's a trade-off sometimes.
Makes sense. Let's say you're working on a project with customer data. What's the deal with customer address versus address as a class name?
Customer address as a class name is a bad idea, though customer address as a variable name is totally fine. Address is fine as a class, unless you need to distinguish between different types of addresses. This is where you might need shipping address or billing address.
Oh, I see. So, it's about clarity and avoiding redundancy in that case.
Exactly. You only add context to the name if it's essential, if it adds something to the information.
Thanks, Robert. That's really helpful.
No problem. Clear names are readable.
That makes it easier to maintain.
Great point.
Thanks. So, Robert, we've been talking about writing code that's easy to understand. You mentioned structure, clarity, but it's not just how things are organized, it's also what they're called, right?
Absolutely. A well-chosen name is like a good signpost in a complicated codebase. It tells you where you're going without needing a map. Poor naming is a silent killer.
But how do you know what a good name is? I mean, there's room for different opinions, right?
It really comes down to being descriptive and using shared understanding. Bad names are often vague or overly simplistic. Imagine a function called process_data. What does it process?
Yeah, that's a problem. How do you bridge the gap between what's vague and clear?
Good naming is a teaching issue, not a technical one. It's about using language that everyone in your development team or community will understand. That language is often influenced by the wider software development community.
So, it's not just about personal preference?
Not entirely. But well-placed cultural context is crucial to ensure a common language. Think about using industry-standard jargon or commonly accepted terms within the project.
What about the fear of renaming? Why is it so prevalent in your experience?
Some developers fear that renaming things will break code or confuse other developers. It's not unlike the fear of anything new in our lives, a bit of inertia.
But you said you aren't afraid of renaming?
Nope. I often find renaming clarifies things and improves code health. The modern refactoring tools make the process smooth. A simple change can have a huge impact on readability and clarity.
So how do you manage to overcome the fear?
By focusing on the bigger picture and understanding that renaming makes the code more maintainable. Good names promote efficiency and clarity for the long run.
Any specific tools you recommend for refactoring?
Plenty out there. I often mention a specific refactoring tool. It helps automate the process.
Sounds like a powerful tool for improving code clarity. Really interesting.